Welcome to an event I'm really thrilled to offer tonight as part of Antioch Works for Democracy. It's called The Assault on Democracy, Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging. The Case of Texas and Beyond, a special fireside chat with the head of the ACLU in Texas, Oni Blair, and the vice chair of the ACLU in Texas and Antioch alum, Froswa Booker. Before we start, let me just say I'm Lorian Alexandre. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a longtime administrator at Antioch University and have been involved in creating this program, which we call Antioch Works for Democracy. It's a multi-month, multi-pronged set of education and action to strengthen an inclusive democracy. It includes voter registration efforts, a fund to support community university projects, employee days of action, and a whole series, I counted them today, 32 over these 4 months, 32 presentations, panels to help educate us about the dynamics of what is going on in this country. Tonight, we have a 1 hour, this is Froswa's idea, I think, to call it a sort of fireside chat. So imagine we're sitting around a campsite, colleagues, friends, trust, compassion and interest in figuring out sort of with these two amazing women, Texas-based activists who will be sharing their reflections on what is happening in their state and the struggle they are engaged in every day to protect civil liberties and fight for human rights. We're calling it a fireside case study to learn about one state to help us think about and understand what is happening across the country. Oni K. Blair is the executive director of the ACLU in Texas, an organization that, of course, we are all familiar with, that's working with communities in that state and across the country to protect and advance a more just and inclusive society. And Dr. Froswa Booker is vice chair of the ACLU in Texas, and yes, a graduate of Antioch's PhD in Leadership and Change. I have it down in 2014. I don't know if that's right, but I think it is. So 10 years ago. And as of this year, is a new member of the Antioch University Board of Governors. The idea for this event was actually sparked by some conversations that I had with representatives of Antioch's Faculty Senate and Antioch's Messy Conversations. So I'd like to think we are all sitting around this fireside together fighting for democracy. And with that, let me say before I hand it over, the format will be that Froswa and Ani will engage in this conversation for about 30, 40 minutes. However, the Q&A is set up. If you have questions, post them to the Q&A, and we will get to those questions after this sort of chat conversation. And with that, I'm going to go off screen and hand it over to you, Froswa and Ani. Thank you so much.
Lorian, thank you so much. I joke and tell everyone I am a poster child for Antioch University. It transformed my life, really defined my work in being a scholar practitioner, and I'm grateful for this opportunity to be with you all this evening. Lorian was my advisor and still serves as a mentor and friend. And so when she approached me about this opportunity to share the work, I said, oh no, I can't do this alone. I've got to bring in this brilliant woman that I get to work with on the ACLU board. And I joined the ACLU because I was so impressed with the work and the leadership of this amazing, absolutely brilliant woman, and the focus and vision that she has and the team that supports her. What they do every single day to fight for the rights of those who are not at the table, who often are not seen and heard, is beyond impressive. And so just to play a tiny role in this amazing work. I'm honored to do so. And so I want to introduce the lady of the hour who makes all of this happen. It's Oni K. Blair. And Oni is the executive director of the American Civil Liberties Union of Texas, which is a statewide nonpartisan organization that works with communities at the state capitol and in the courts to protect and advance civil rights and civil liberties for every Texan with no exceptions. Previously, Blair led Link Houston, which shaped a $7 billion transit plan and won $51.5 million for Black and Latinx communities impacted by highway expansion. As a Foreign Service officer with the U.S. State Department, Blair directed the Human Rights Bureau's Near Eastern Affairs Office, served as a special assistant to the U.S. Deputy Secretary, and worked at U.S. embassies in Jordan, Pakistan, and Iraq. Blair served on the Biden-Harris transition and co-chair of the transition team for Harris County Judge Lena Hidalgo, chief executive of the third largest county in the country. She is a Council on Foreign Relations member, Truman National Security Project Fellow, and 2021-22 Belfer Center non-resident fellow with the Harvard Kennedy School. She is a baddie. And so I'm so glad you're here and to work with you on this impactful, transformative work that you do every day. And so my first question to you is, share your journey to ACLU because you've done a lot. And so what made you say yes to wanting to be a part of this organization and lead this work?
Well, thank you, Dr. Booker and Dr. Alexandre and everyone at Antioch for coming today, for hosting this special event, and for choosing to highlight the work and the impact that the ACLU of Texas has had across the state. I come into this work as someone who grew up in a household where public service was very important and working in community was very important. I grew up in a home where my parents always took us to events to learn about and talk about at home the civil rights movement. And at one point early on, I thought I would be an engineer, and I used to go to like engineering camps and all those things. And at some point I started questioning, wouldn't it be fun to explain to communities or to like young kids of color what it means to be an engineer and work at NASA, or what the impact is, or how it could change their lives? And the more I kept thinking, the more I was getting away from the engineering part and getting more interested in how it impacted people. And at some point, I accepted that I really wanted to be involved in the next wave of whatever it was working on civil rights. And I thought I would go to law school because that was like the only way to be able to work on civil rights. Like nobody talked to me about PhD programs. Nobody talked to me about master's programs. No one even talked about what you could do with the bachelor's. It was, you go to law school, that's what you do. And in college, I interned at the Office of the City Attorney here in Houston, and I hated it. And I thought the work that they were doing was so fascinating and so important, but I was like, that's not the work or kind of work that I want to do. And at some point in my summer internship, the attorneys needed to go take notes at city council meeting, and nobody wanted to do that job. And so they offered me, the intern, to go take notes across the street. And I went, and my mind was blown. I was like, whatever this is that people are doing is what I want to do. And there were just, neighbors organizing. And I have the language for it now. Like, I didn't know that they were organizing, but I was like, all these people are saying the same thing. And they like shared their script before they got here. And these elected officials who are really important know some of them, and they're addressing them. They're asking them questions, or sometimes people were just there by themselves. So I volunteered for the rest of the summer to go across the street and take notes. And then I went back to school, and I was like, maybe the pathway is not only through a law school, and that is definitely a way that's important, but it's not my way. And I felt like maybe I was a failure because law school is so important, and that's what everybody thinks of. But I was also very comfortable in recognizing that wasn't my path, and I wasn't sure what it was. So to make a long story short, I stumbled on a fellowship that paid for the rest of my undergrad and graduate school. And it was for a master's degree in public policy with a special focus on international affairs. And it would prepare you to be able to go into the Foreign Service. And I started reading into it, and I was like, oh, my interest in human rights and civil rights is also an international struggle and something that people do around the world. And so I took this path. I went to Harvard for my graduate program and then joined the Foreign Service. And within the Foreign Service, took a special interest in doing humanitarian work and human rights work, and did a long time working on those issues. And then I switched in 2016, pre-election. People are always like, you did it after the election. Like, no, it was actually pre-election, being in Washington and hearing people say, you know, the only people who matter are on the East Coast and in California. All the people in the middle don't know what they're talking about. They're not going to vote anyway. They don't understand politics. And I just really wanted to get out of the Beltway bubble. And so I found a way to come home and connect that experience, those experiences that I'd had overseas, and work in the mayor's office here in Houston, back in my hometown. And I wasn't sure how long that would last. I mean, the fellowship was for a year because I was still working for the State Department. But when I got home, I really realized like I really wanted to be home, and it was more than just a notion. So I found a way to stay, and I left the Foreign Service. And I recognize now, like, the work that I was doing, leading the Human Rights Office in Foreign Affairs, we were covering voting rights of underrepresented groups in 22 countries in the Middle East and North Africa. We were working on issues of people being detained pre-trial, so not being able to get out and not being charged with anything for months or years. Free speech of political, for political speech issues, people being detained or tortured or disappearing because they were just speaking what they believed in. Issues of how women are treated and what opportunities they have, how LGBTQIA people are treated, how immigrants are treated, and whether they're allowed to be there safely, if they're protected, if they're allowed to seek asylum. And those are exactly the issues that I work on now at the ACLU-Texas, every single one of those. And it is fascinating to people when I compare that, because they're like, you did international, then you switched to domestic. Those don't even relate. And like, I did the same issues. I use the same toolkits. We do reports. We work with communities to understand what they're doing. We give resources. We do big communications campaigns to explain to people, or to name and shame. If you do backdoor diplomacy, if people are willing to listen to you, work behind the scenes quietly to figure out a way forward. And when they refuse to answer the door for you, then you name and shame them. Then you call them out on the news. And that's what you do in the Foreign Service. It's literally like, you notice our allies, you don't call them out, because that's the respect. They're so willing to talk to you behind the scenes. But for countries that no longer talk to us, that's who you talk about from the podium. That's how human rights policy is made. It's the same way. I'm not going to talk about the sheriff who's still opening the door and trying to work with us to figure out a way to make this work on our immigration policy. If they're willing to listen and maybe not enforce that law that even they know is ridiculous, but they're scared of getting in trouble. But for somebody who won't talk to us at all, then you're like, no, that's what the report is going to be about, and we're going to find all the data to back it up.
You'll see your name in print.
So that's how I came to be here, and that's I like to remind people, and especially if you're pursuing your PhD and you're thinking about what comes next, keep things open. There are more things that are related than are not. And the skill sets are what really matter. The skill sets of being able to understand data and being able to collect data or use data and to analyze it, ways to communicate with people and explain to people what's happening, to make relationships and connections and patterns. And the more that you can do it in ways that seem odd that everybody else isn't doing it, the more you are ensuring that AI will not take your job away.
That's another conversation about how that impacts our work. You said something that I think most people think about Texas. You were talking about when you were in DC and how people said, we don't vote. There are all these myths that people have about Texas and our politics. And I often have friends who are on the East Coast who are like, oh my God, I can't believe you're progressive. And I'm like, there is a tribe of people that I'm around that think the way that I do, and some who are even more progressive than I am. Dispel some myths that people have who may not have visited Texas about our politics. And even though we know that there are some challenges, there are a lot of them that you fight every day. Talk about some of the myths that people have around the work that you do and about this state.
That's a really great question. I think some of them are positive and some are negative and some are just, just lack of knowledge. One thing that I find that is very impactful for the work that we do is that people often don't understand how diverse Texas is, and especially someplace like Houston. And if you're not in Houston or haven't spent time in Houston, Houston is 20% Black. It's like, I don't know, but the numbers range between 40, well, the last I looked, it was 49% Latinx, and about 6 to 10% Asian. If you're in the suburbs, some of the suburbs are even above 10%, but that's really diverse. And most people just do not understand that. And when you have an electorate that has that sort of pluralism, those sort of pluralistic opportunities rather, then it makes a really big difference on some of the things that we work on, especially around everything from free speech and ensuring that people can feel like they're represented in the history, in the books, and how they dress, especially for students, to what it means for voting rights and ensuring that everybody has the opportunity to vote. Houston is 1 in 25 people, sorry, 1 in 4 people in Houston is foreign born. So when you think of that, some of the barriers that people are like, oh, it's just a voter ID, like it's not a big deal. Somebody can use a different ID rather than, a driver's license. You can't use a driver's license if you are X. There was something that came out this weekend that said the sort of temporary license that new citizens often get will not, that the opinion is that you should not be able to use it when you go vote. Well, when you live in a place that looks like this, that is this diverse with this many new Americans, it is like something like that is actually very impactful and blocks off whole groups of people who cannot vote. So that is one thing, one myth, that everyone in Texas is white with a 10-gallon hat and Spurs is damaging to understanding when there are announcements about these laws, just how many people it is really impacting. I would say another one is that I find particularly damaging is that people don't understand how militarized the border is. And I was reading this book by Jose Antonio Vargas. You may remember him. He was a journalist and Filipino and undocumented. And he came out and talked about, like on the front page, he talked about being undocumented after he had this long, very successful career in journalism, and then launched an organization and has continued to speak out about this work. And at one point in the book, he goes to Texas and people are like, so how are you going to get back when you go to the border? And he didn't understand. He's like, we're not crossing. But he really didn't understand how militarized the border is. And that is also just something that people don't recognize, that when you are on the border, there are lots of law enforcement officials. And if laws like SB4, the local and state enforcement of immigration that the Texas legislature passed in 2023, if those are allowed to go into effect, then your local, your city police officer can arrest you, detain you, and basically hand you over to be deported. These are not things that people really comprehend. And so you don't think about if I don't look a certain way, I can't just go to the doctor if I want to. I have to stop at checkpoints and constantly show my documentation. They don't think about the access to a hospital, that there are high-speed chases that kill people all the time. They don't think of all of these things that come into play when you live in a militarized zone, and the impact on healthcare, just on your mental health, on your access to school, on your access to so many parts of your life. So I would say I'll stop there, but those are two really big ones that I find that really impact how people understand the work that we do and what's happening here in the state.
You've alluded to the political landscape and some of the issues that you address. Talk a bit more about what you all are focusing on, you and the team at the ACLU, because I know the border is something that you all have been in court around a lot of those issues. So share a little bit more about the political landscape and some of those issues that ACLU of Texas is addressing.
Thanks for that tee up. Before I go into the issues, I want to just explain the ACLU a little bit. So the American Civil Liberties Union is a federated structure. That means that we're basically in a family of organizations. So there are a few other major organizations that people may know, from Planned Parenthood to Habitat for Humanity. There are others that are all federated. So that means there's an ACLU National, and ACLU National covers federal issues or nationwide issues, and they are independent, and they've been around for over 100 years. And then there are 54 affiliates. We're not chapters, so we're not run by volunteers, we're run by professionals, and we are independent organizations. So I, at the ACLU of Texas, run one of the largest affiliates, and we are both a 501c3, which means we do the education, we do litigation under that, and I mean public education, communications around that. And then we're also a 501c4. So by tax law, that means it's not tax deductible, but we do lobbying under that piece. So we actually have people at the legislature who sometimes try to stop bad laws, try to make proposed laws or bills not so bad, and in a good moment are actually successful in proposing something, especially in coalitions. So we use all of those different strategies. But in Texas, it's really hard, right? In California, the most populous state in the United States, has 4 affiliates. Texas is the second largest and has 1 affiliate. So we're doing a lot with a lot less. They have, each of their 4 affiliates has a budget at least the size of mine, if not multiple times over larger and with more people. It's because they have more access to capital, for lack of a better word, in California than we do here. So with that, we use all those tactics, the communications, the community engagement, the lobbying and the litigation, to be able to protect and advance civil liberties and civil rights. So that means voting rights and democracy take up a majority of our work, especially during this time leading up to election, because everything ties back to voting rights and democracy. And that's everything from challenging the Senate Bill 1, SB 1, as we call it for short, the voter suppression law that was passed in 2021 in response to the vast expansion of voting rights and voter access in 2020 that particularly happened in Harris County. So this law slaps down things like 24-hour voting or drive-through voting, or certain aspects on how you sign your voter registration or your mail-in ballot with the exact ID number that you used, decades ago whenever you first registered to vote, or the exact signature on the outside, or how you go into the booth and who's able to help you. So we have been successful in litigating that. There were oral arguments over a year ago. As of Friday, we've actually heard back on all of the claims, and we have successfully, the judges ruled in favor of us. This is a really big moment. That said, the Attorney General is like, every time a new claim comes out that we win on, immediately appeals it. So who knows what will happen, but I'm celebrating that win.
Yes.
But with that, also within that voting rights, we do jail-based voting because, again, I'm going to use Harris County because it's so large, so it becomes, and it's such a leader in this space that it becomes emblematic of the efforts that, in the opportunity that could be. So in Harris County, 70% of the people who are detained are actually detained pretrial, so they haven't been convicted of anything. So they are eligible to vote. So the challenge is, like, making that a reality. It's one thing to say that you're eligible, but how do you make sure that there's a polling station inside the jail, or that people are allowed to get absentee ballots if there are challenges to getting absentee ballots? How do you get a pencil? And if it's deemed a weapon, right? So being able to do jail-based voting. We do a lot of voter education, educating, the elderly on making sure you know what the address is where you're registered to vote. What ID are you going to use? What's your plan? Answering questions like that. And also for people who are new Americans, people who don't speak English as their first language, people with disabilities, because all of these things come into play as the law makes it harder. So we can come back to voting rights a little bit later because there's so much to talk about, but I do want to go through the other issues. And I always start with that because everything ties back to it. We work on immigration, as you mentioned. I mentioned earlier SB 4, the Senate Bill 4, which is the local and state enforcement of federal law, which constitutionally it's federal law. It's supposed to be implemented by the federal government on immigration, but this would allow people who are not trained in immigration to be able to suspect somebody is here without the appropriate documentation, arrest, detain, hand them over to a court without counsel, and then they are deported. And because they have counsel, once they're deported, as someone who worked, the other side of consular work, it's very difficult to get back in under any circumstance once that happens. We do smart justice work. That's a lot of pretrial detention work and trying to eliminate or reduce who is held for bail. LGBTQIA work, a lot of our work focuses on trans rights. So again, tying back to immigration, most recently the directive from the head of our state government saying that trans people cannot get their appropriate gender marker on their state IDs. Well, that means everyone who needs an update on their ID or hasn't gotten one can't get their state ID, and you have to have a state ID to vote, because that's the other thing that the state has said, is that you have to have a state ID to vote. That affects so many people, including my own staff. So all of those things tie back to that voting rights and democracy piece. We also work on abortion and access to healthcare, which is a large issue. Right now, our work has shifted over the last couple of years. We were representing, we were co-counsel on the SB 8. That's the case that was the 6-week abortion ban after it passed in 2021. And since then, we continue to work on abortion and healthcare advocacy. And with that, it's not just litigation, but we have what's called the Texas Abortion Access Network, Advocacy Network, which trains people, particularly in West Texas, to be able to be advocates around abortion and healthcare access. So the reason why this is important is because in West Texas in particular, many towns and counties are creating laws that criminalize people who are pregnant and seeking any kind of abortion care, even if it's over state lines. So imagine living in a place where someone says, I think you might be pregnant, and therefore I'm going to, either it's rarely arrest, but that, in some cases, or fine you for doing this on top of what the law already says, even though you're trying to get an abortion in New Mexico or in Kansas or somewhere else. And so the advocates who've gone through this are basically learning how to navigate local government. How do you sign up at a city council meeting or a commissioner's court meeting? How do you develop your talking points? Where do you go to read on information? How do you connect with other people and organize them so that you all go up at the same time? All those things that led me to come into this work is what they are training to do. And then once you do something that's so exciting and you realize that you are part of how government works and you have the right to be civically engaged, people get involved in all sorts of issues. We're using that same education model in free speech, which I find super fun. We do a lot of free speech work with K through 12 students. And so if you think of book bans, dress codes, hair codes, especially that make Black students feel unwelcome in the education system, we would not be in school.
We'd be put out.
Then those are all free speech issues, protesting on a university campus. So we we work with students so that they can be seen and heard in school, that they feel like they have a place, that their history is the history of the state of Texas, and work with students, their families, educators on doing that same thing that I mentioned with the Texas Abortion Advocacy Network. So we introduce them to the data, right? We help them understand what is a school board meeting, that in most places, unless you're in Houston where your school board was fired by the state government, then your school
don't get me started on that one
officials are
either.
elected and they work for you. How do you sign up at a school board meeting? How do you prepare your time? How do you do a message? How do you work with your classmates to be able to get them there? So whether it's a school board meeting or the county meeting or the city meeting on the public library, that it's not us. You will rarely see us at one of those meetings. We're supporting, helping people have the resources and the skill sets to go do this on their own. And there's like nothing more joyous when a student or the student and their parents like send you a picture or you read about in the newspaper, you're like, oh my gosh, our name is nowhere on there, but this is so awesome. we had a part in like making sure that they got to say their truth. They had access. So I'll pause there, but that's just a little piece.
It's a lot.
It is, but you'll also see how all of those are tied together, right? For free speech, if I can't speak, then I can't vote, right? If I never have the right to an asylum, then I never get to vote. Or if somebody believes that I'm not here legally, or they don't acknowledge that English is not the only language of power in this state, then I never get a chance to vote, even if I am a citizen, right? All of these things, I mean, I love using the example of trans people in Texas and the driver's license right now, or other state ID, because it makes people recognize like it's not by accident that they came out 2 weeks before it's voting time. Like that affects people's ability to vote. And so while they all may seem different, they're all always so connected. And at the ACLU, one of the benefits that we have is where not many organizations are multi-issue. So we're able to work at the intersection and still stay true to our mission, right? I can work at the intersection of a person seeking asylum who also, had an experience that is now they need abortion care immediately, or a Black trans person, and the multiple intersection of issues that we're talking about, or people who are being held, pre-trial and haven't been convicted anything, but these multiple issues have caused them to not be able to access the things that make life easy for us, and ID, which means they can't get housing and they can't get access to school. And so now they don't have anything left and are in jail for no reason. Like those are all things that come together. And so our partners, sometimes who are single issue, come to us because we can help them work at the intersection when we partner.
One of the things I want you to talk a bit about, and then I'll have a final question before we open up to the audience, is the election, because we are less than a month out. And I'd love for you to share with the audience a bit more about what are some of the strategies that ACLU is, are involved in addressing. Who are some of the folks that you're working with? What are some of the challenges that you're seeing? You mentioned a few, but I'd love for you to share a bit more about this fight that we have across the state. And I think people forget, Texas, although we have some major urban areas like a Houston and Dallas and Austin and San Antonio, our state has a lot of rural areas too, and a lot of smaller cities. And that's where the challenge lies around a lot of the elections, because we have a very significant rural community. And sometimes the urban areas may not be able to carry the state despite how populous they may be. There are over 10,000 plus towns that are in our state. So talk a bit about, with this election, what are you seeing? What are you all delving into around voting?
So with the election, I want to repeat that we're not a partisan organization, and we have definitely sued both sides. We sued the Trump administration, we sued the Biden administration, we've sued red counties, we've sued Harris County, Blue County. So that is important to state in this space, because the important thing that is everybody has the access to do what under the Constitution we should be able to do, and more. Like, how do we keep expanding those rights within our state and across and slowly, across the country. When it comes to rural issues, it's a yes and, right? Like, we only have so much capacity. And so our work on different times will touch rural areas, sometimes more than others. We definitely work with a lot of rural legislators during the legislative season, because sometimes you'll find that the same issues that are affecting rural communities are the issues that are affecting the urban underrepresented communities, because they're all being left out, right?
Yes.
We're about to see that on issues that we don't touch but are adjacent to a lot of our issues, like vouchers. There are a lot of issues, multiple issues that we touch are not directly vouchers, but they're adjacent to vouchers. So we follow vouchers very closely. And on vouchers, it's the rural and then the urban underrepresented who recognize that whether you pass vouchers or not, if you pass it, it doesn't benefit us. Like, we're not going to get the benefit. So it's finding where those allyships are. For getting back to your question, presently on elections. So on elections, we're doing a lot of work around what we call election protection, which is ensuring that people know what their rights are to vote. People have access to vote. So that's not only the SB1 case that I mentioned earlier, that Senate Bill 1 on voter suppression, but also ensuring that there are poll monitors in places that has historically had issues around disenfranchising, so that people are essentially being election observers, if you will, like, to use the international language. You're observing what's happening, you're able to report it. And also we have a hotline where people can report or ask questions about an ID. Like, they said that I couldn't use my ID. They said that that I can't take my daughter in, who's always, I need her to translate for me. Or they said that she can't translate what I asked her to translate. She can only do this one thing for me. Or, I take my mom and I push her in, and they're saying that I can't push her in because I'm not the designated, whatever it may be. Like, all of those things are hard to do. And so this comes up because of, like, our limitations on staffing. We have areas where we're in kind of the suburban and exurban areas that are around some of the historically marginalized places. So we're in, like, Collin County, right? We're in Fort Worth, we're in Dallas, but we're specifically in Collin County because Collin County is rural. My sister lives in Collin County, so I can say this with with a degree of certainty because I go there fairly frequently. It is very rural, but it's still, like, on the edge of Dallas, but it is separate. It is also where America is working itself out. Like, if you have been to Collin County, it is fascinating because it's very rural. And then my sister has neighbors from India, from the Caribbean, from Pakistan, from the Middle East, from like Europe. It's all over, from Latin America, and a lot from California.
Yeah, they're moving in.
And it's just this amazing, interesting place, right? But in reality, it's still rural. And so we're there in Collin County, but we can't be everywhere because we don't have that many staff people. And so the way that we do that is we do a lot on mass communications. And our mass communications, I'm really proud to say, like, they've gotten so much better over the last couple of years. We actually lead in ACLU affiliates for our followings online. So we put a lot of material that is both fun and engaging, but just easy to access on every social media platform and online. But we also have digital ads that are, like, pushing information out. And we've just purchased several billboard ads that are in these kind of exurban areas where you're getting into the rural, but still very much on the outskirts of the urban areas. So if you see one in your community, I hope it's effective. And I hope you see them rolling around, like, whether it's the billboard, or we have some that are the mobile units that will be headed out and deployed over the next 2 weeks, because early voting starts next week on Tuesday or Monday, 21st.
So my last question for you is, how can this audience help you? What can they do to support the work that's happening in Texas around civil liberties, and anything that you need from them to help you continue the great work that you and your team are doing every single day on the ground?
I appreciate that. And I saw that someone asked a question related to this as well. So I have a couple of pieces. Well, first of all, go vote. Vote. Make sure you have a plan to vote, and then once you have your own plan, make sure that every person in your family who is eligible to vote, particularly if your family involves someone who is under the age of 25, that they have a plan to vote. Like there is actually a time and transportation involved, and any translation and what ID you're going to use, like we take it for granted that everybody knows all the things that you need to go vote. And if you're not sure, definitely check out ACLU-TX.org, and we have lots of, know your rights on voting. Two, I will both answer the question and also address another issue that I didn't address yet, is the state is definitely doing a lot of investigations on nonprofit organizations within the state of Texas around compliance on C3 and C4 issues. So talking about, who to vote for when you're not actually a C4 or you're doing something else in that space. So I would advise people to be careful, but what you can do is you can invite like organizations like the ACLU of Texas to do that voter rights education for you that we are trained and have had compliance experts look at, so it is safely within the C3 realm, so that the burden isn't on you. Use the resources that are available. We're free. And there are other groups that do that, but use those free resources. And the threats are real on the investigations on nonprofits. So I just urge people to be vigilant, especially at this time. The last thing I would say is I mentioned the poll monitors, those kind of election observers who were there, and I'll give you some examples of why they're important. One simple one is reporting on what happens when what time the poll opened. So in some instances, people will say, "Oh, the voting booth opened on time," and you're like, "No, it didn't. I was here. I was here at 7:30 and y'all didn't open till 8:15. It's like, like that is important. That's a violation and needs to be taken immediately to the county clerk. And they need to either extend the time and contact people on what's happening. Like that's an issue. And the opposite too, when it's reported that something did close and it wasn't closed and it was open. So being able to have people volunteer. So if people are looking for a way, especially if you're the type of person who's already like registering people to vote because you're extra involved, like you can't register people anymore. So this is a great way for you to sign up to be a poll monitor. You can also go onto our website at ACLU-TX.org and you can find it under Get Involved. The training is an hour long, that's all, and then sign up with a friend. And your shift can be as short as 2 hours, or you can sign up for multiple shifts on the same day or anytime during the lead up in the early voting period. But I cannot stress how important that role is, because it's people who are on the ground and then, or either reporting to the hotline or helping to answer questions, who are the ones who, like in Harris County, when they ran out of paper, led to us suing Harris County and saying, no, you ran out of paper. People couldn't vote and it interrupted voting for 2 hours. You have to find paper, get somebody to bring it over here and keep the poll open for 2 more hours. And we got that verdict immediately and they had to open the poll. And they were pissed with us, but that's the right thing to do. like that's what it's supposed to do. And so that comes from, that protects the right to vote for people, and it comes from people volunteering, just like everyone who is at this space right now, to be able to be a volunteer, especially in communities that have been disenfranchised, communities with persons with disabilities, aging, communities that speak more than English, or for which English may not be the primary language, and then Black and Brown communities that have been targeted or criminalized. And there have been a lot of Black people in particular who have been arrested, and women of color arrested or charged with fraudulent voting, and that it's just never been found. So,
Oni, I want to thank you for sharing your brilliance. I want to turn it back over to Karen and Lorian to ask questions. I think we have a few that have been raised. And so you all, Karen, take it away.
Thank you so much for being here. This has just been such an important conversation, and we're so honored to have you both here to share this with us. We have 2 questions that have come in, and if you have any others, please feel free to add them into the Q&A at the bottom. And you kind of touched on this a little bit, but hoping if you want to add more, how can nonprofit organizations that are not specifically focused on these legal issues most impact or participate in this conversation?
So I mentioned some of those volunteering ways. I mean, especially with voting. Let me start there. For voting, and at this particular time, ensuring that people make a plan, ensuring that, and then also signing up to be a poll monitors. I cannot stress how important that is right now. But that's an important way. And one of the things we find with poll monitors is people get excited, they'll show interest, they'll go to the training. But then if you sign up by yourself, that you won't show up because it's like, not as fun, or it's kind of scary. It might feel scary because it's something new if you're doing it by yourself. So to be able to do that in community with people is really important, because if you're in community, you're going to show up. And we really need people to be able to observe what's happening and report if something is not true. In a state where people are constantly challenging elections and the process, having nonpartisan observers to be able to go back and ask you, did you see what they said or is happening? Or, that is important, whether it's voter intimidation or the poll opening on time.
You touched on this one a little bit, but I'm going to read this one. As a fellow Texan and a small blue dot in a red community, how can I advocate for the inclusion and acceptance among my neighbors and friends? Are there softly persuasive tactics that can open the conversations among those who would otherwise not talk to each other? And do you have any thoughts about changing minds one-to-one versus the larger scope of the organizations?
That's a great question. I don't know if I'm the best qualified to answer it. I don't know. I mean, I do think that one-on-one conversations are hugely impactful, and you'll find, everybody has a story. Everybody has a story that probably touches on every issue that you're thinking of. As you're listening to this story and really listen, I think people care about listening and reminding people when you listen that you heard their story and that there are other people who share that experience. Maybe not exactly, but let me give you an example. I was at a friend's house, and I was there with my family and then the family that was hosting, and then they had invited one other family. And the other family was like very conservative. And we were all chatting, and the mom was, chatting and, trying to really show her that she disagreed with many of the things that my organization stands for. That's fine. And then she mentioned something about abortion. And then she said, well, actually, I had an ectopic pregnancy. And so some people might, these are her words, some people might consider that an abortion. And I just listened, and she shared. And at the end, said, thank you so much for sharing your story. That's hard. And I don't expect everybody to share their story. It's deeply personal and probably very painful to share that. And I hope you remember that other people have that experience too. And everybody has the right to make a decision that you needed to make for your family and your health. I don't know that I changed her mind. I'm not like, I appreciate, and I recognize that not every conversation, but what I wanted her to walk away with is that we're willing to listen to things that may be different than what it is that I'm, than the statement that I'm saying, or the interest that I am holding up, and that we may share interests. It may look differently from different perspectives and different experiences, and that your experience and that point of shared interest may be shared with a far greater group. And it can't just be us, the one individual be the exception. There has to be a time when we think about what is it for it to be that everyone can make that decision. So may not have answered your question in the way that you thought, but I hope that you you use the opportunity and the privilege we have to listen.
Lovely. Thank you. Thank you for that. How do you manage your own mental wellness and emotional regularity as you do this necessary but often challenging work, particularly based upon the identities you hold?
Save the tough one for the end. Yeah. I mean, in full disclosure, I take mental health really seriously. It's something that we take really seriously in our family. And I have both, healthcare professional in my own personal regimen and my own faith and faith community where I also just get support and I'm able to talk through things. On a more like micro level, I will also say that I have my own routines and time that I carve out, and that time is very important to me. And it may seem, I don't know, overly rigid, but in the morning I get up and I have 3 little kids. So I need to do a lot to get the morning ready. And they all know, do not wake up or walk out of your room until mommy has finished all the things that you're going to do and mommy takes her walk. Like I am not a nice person unless I take my walk in the morning. And in the evening, you're gonna laugh, but I actually do this every night. Every night I light a candle. Every night I do a reflection. And every night I read for my own pleasure. And that is what I do every single night. So if I'm late getting to bed, it's like, it can be really late by the time I do all that, but that is how I wind down. And I start the day with something for myself that I feel like I can do and finish and some movement. And at the end of the day, I just take a moment and, the candle forces me to breathe deeply because I like the smell, and do something for myself. And in the middle, it's complete chaos. But those are the ends. Those are the bookends to my day.
Gosh, thank
that.
you. Thank you for sharing that. We have one more question and it looks like we have time for it. What attack on DEI are we least aware of?
Oh yeah, I didn't even get to this. Sorry. So just very quickly, it's a lot. So in 2021, the state passed a law prohibiting certain forms of diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI in education. So that includes everything from the 1619 project as part of the curriculum. If you look right there, those are 2 copies of the 1619 project because we brought in Nicole Hannah-Jones right after she was banned and her curriculum was banned. We did an event with over 700 people. And she was like, this is what it looks like to be banned in a state. It's awesome. And then in 2023, so that 2021 law also bans like things like talking about certain things in social studies, including words like identity or intersectionality. And then air quotes for someone who may not be able to see me right now. And then in 2023, there was another law that was passed that banned diversity, equity, inclusion offices. So universities have generally disbanded these offices, and some of them, there was kind of like an overreaction at University of Houston where they immediately closed it down. And in others, they've like dispersed the resources. But if like this includes, LGBTQIA resources or like a team that may have been there for wellness and support to help LGBTQIA students navigate, or things for Black students or Native American students or Latinx students. So those have all been banned. And then in addition to that, there's the book bans, the dress codes, the hair codes that really you're seeing in the K through 12 space across the state. And those are very diffuse. So while we talked about what we're doing on elections, or our capacity to do stuff on elections within the rural areas, we do a ton in rural areas on book bans, dress codes, and hair codes, like doing a ton of complaints to the U.S. Department of Education, working with communities, helping them to have the resources and then go to their city council or their school board meetings to be able to address this. But I don't think people know that these are like actual laws, and that they're 2 different DEI laws specifically, one from 2021 and one from 2023. And the impact, as a student of color, I went to Texas A&M for undergraduate. It's one of the largest universities in the United States. It was 1% Black when I went there. And they started the year that I went there, or the year before that I started, it was fairly new. this program for students of color to basically help you transition into school, just so that you would know where the multicultural office is and like mentors that you could go talk to. It wasn't remedial studies. A lot of people think it's all like remedial study. There were no studying. It was just, let us help you navigate. You can actually meet a few people so that you know you're not alone. Here are these offices and language offices. Anything that you need, come and find us. And I don't know that in a space like that, where I didn't see people a lot of times, that I would have really survived. And I had a great experience at school despite all of the challenges, but it was because I had my little network of people that some of them I met, like my best friend through college, I met there at that program, and that helped me to survive. And so these are really important, and you're seeing the attendance rates drop, and you'll probably see the graduations rates drop. So it's something that's overlooked.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing your insight, your compassion, your hope, and your joy.
Thank you, Dr. Alexandria. Thank you, Dr. Booker.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you for this opportunity. This was awesome.